Welcome to the podcast Nicaea at 1700, a podcast commemorating the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. My name is Jim Skedros, and I am the Michael G. and Anastasia Kantonis Professor of Byzantine Studies and Professor of Early Christianity at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I am the host of this podcast. This podcast is a production of the Scriptorium Initiative at Holy Cross. The various episodes of the podcast bring the insights of Orthodox scholars and theologians regarding the history, theology, and impact of the First Ecumenical Council, which gathered in the city of Nicaea during the summer of 325 AD. In this episode, we'll be looking specifically at the events that occurred at the Council of Nicaea in the summer of 325 AD. We mentioned in an earlier episode that the acts or the minutes of the council don't survive if they ever existed at all. So what we know about the council we have to piece together from some eyewitness accounts that were written after the council, as well as the documents that were published as official texts from the council. And then finally, some later historians at the end of the 4th and the first half of the 5th century that are writing about the Council of Nicaea. Traditionally, it's been said that 318 bishops attended the Council of Nicaea. We do have lists of signators, that is, bishops who signed at the Council of Nicaea. These lists survive in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, and Arabic. And scholars have sat down and tried to piece together from these lists the exact number or close to the number of bishops that attended. At best, scholars can come up with about 250 bishops or so that they think attended the Council of Nicaea. It begs a question then, if it's only 250, where does the number 318 come from? Athanasius of Alexandria, who did attend the council as a deacon. He was the deacon of Bishop of Alexandria, whose name was Alexander. And he writes a few decades after the council, not too long after the council, he writes that there were about 300 bishops in attendance. So it's not far-fetched to think that there were 318 bishops in attendance. That's a traditional number. It's usually said that this number 318 comes from Genesis 14, where Abraham had 318 servants noted in Genesis 14. It's a possibility. Ultimately, we don't know. But in general, I think it's fair to say that at least 250 bishops attended. The number 318 is not out of the realm of possibilities. The council was held in the city of Nicaea at the imperial palace. It gathered in the great hall of the imperial palace, and Eusebius describes the hall as set up in this large hall set up on both sides of lines of bishops on either side, probably 2 or 3 rows of bishops on each side, and that Constantine enters in. Eusebius describes for us this remarkable scene as Constantine enters into the great hall. The bishops are standing and they're waiting for the okay from Constantine to take their seat. Constantine addresses the council. We have his opening remarks. He addressed the council in Latin, and we are told that a Greek translation was given as well. Constantine knows Greek. It might be that he speaks in Latin because he sees this as an official gathering, and official documents in the Roman Empire were produced in Latin. It's most likely that the chair of the council was Bishop Osios of Cordova, Cordova being a city in southern Spain. Osios is a fascinating figure. He has been associated with Constantine for quite a while. We know that he was with Constantine as he enters Rome in 312, when Constantine takes over the city of Rome, defeats Maxentius. He is already in Constantine's entourage at that point. Osios was well respected by Constantine and trusted by him. And so in all the extant lists of signators of the Council of Nicaea, Osios' name comes first. And then the signators are the 2 representatives of the Pope or the Bishop of Rome, and these were both deacons at the time. And it's not unusual for a bishop who can't attend, or for the Roman bishop who didn't come personally, to send legates, and they would sign in the Bishop of Rome's name. So it's most likely, again, that Hosios is overseeing the council. He is the chairman of the council. He's the one who's going to call on people and set up the schedule for the council. There's no doubt that there is imperial assistance, in the sense that there are imperial scribes and imperial servants who are there to help, organize and manage things. Constantine, we are told, probably participates in the debates. It's not unusual. Eusebius says in the life of Constantine that Constantine would lean over and say something here or there. There's always this conversation that scholars have. Was it Constantine who introduced the word homoousios? Eusebius seems to say that he was a supporter of the word, hints that maybe he introduced it, maybe he didn't. It doesn't mean that Constantine is directly involved in the theological debates. He's interested in the outcome. The outcome for him is peace within the Christian church. He calls the council, that is, he brings the participants together. He pays for their way, as we said in an earlier episode, and he's there to support them and to make sure that the job that needs to get done gets done. And for him, the job is really peace within the Christian communities, so that this peace will radiate into peace throughout the empire. Not that there isn't necessarily peace in the empire, but that the Christian God, whatever Constantine's affiliation, belief is in the Christian God, that the Christian God is looking favorably upon Constantine and upon the empire. I do think that by 325, Constantine clearly sees himself as, if not an agent of the Christian God, but someone whom the Christian God has assisted, is maybe looking over, in addition perhaps to pagan gods as well. It's very possible that Constantine is sharing both of these kinds of views. As mentioned, unfortunately, we don't have the debates that took place at Nicaea, so we can't really say how the debates unfolded. We do know that there were 4 main issues addressed at Nicaea. There was the issue of Arius, which seems to have been the most important issue. There's the issue of the date of Easter. There's the issue of a schism in Alexandria that we call, as historians, we refer to it as the Meletian Schism. We'll say a word about that. And then we know that the council also produced 20 canons, or 20 administrative statements for the organization and structure and proper maintenance of the church. Specific issues that seem to have been brought to Nicaea, and that those at Nicaea, since the church had gathered so many people together, felt that it was an appropriate time to address these issues. Much debate must have centered around Arius, and then we do know that a creed is issued, the Nicene Creed as we refer to it. Arius is condemned. He did not attend the council, as best we can tell. He was not at the council, but he is exiled as well, and he will die in exile just before Constantine himself dies in 337. Arius will die in exile in 336. But the creed, which ends with, "and in the Holy Spirit," there is an additional several statements that are added that are anathemas against Arius. And they're on the screen here. But those who say there was a time when he was not, that's a quote that Arius seems to have said, "and he was not before he was made, and he was made out of nothing, or he is of another substance or essence, or the Son of God is created or changeable or alterable." These seem to be statements that were associated with Arius and his supporters. All those people who say these things, they are condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So we have this creed. We believe in one God, and then the Son, and then the Holy Spirit. And at the end, we have what are called these anathemas. In addition to the issue of Arius, we have the issue of the date of Easter. And here it seems that the biggest issue here is making sure that the church celebrates on the same day universally. There was the date of the 14th of Nisan, which is the 14th day of the lunar month of on the Jewish calendar of Nisan, when Passover begins. And some Christians, mostly from Asia Minor, were celebrating Christ's crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection on that day. But most Christians were celebrating the resurrection of Christ on the Sunday immediately following that day, the 14th of Nisan. And the council will decide that Christians should celebrate Easter, the resurrection of Christ, on the same day, and that the celebration of the Sunday after 14 Nisan, which is essentially the beginning of Passover, is the day for which the Easter should be celebrated. And we have a podcast that will unpack that for you. The Meletian Schism was a schism that came out of persecution in the beginning of the 4th century in the great persecution of Diocletian, specifically in Alexandria. When persecution begins in 303, the Bishop of Alexandria, Peter, goes into hiding, and he will run the Alexandrian church basically in hiding, and then he'll get arrested in 308, and he'll be put in jail, and he'll eventually be martyred in 311. During this time, there was a local presbyter whose name was Meletius, and Meletius will take over control of the church, or administrative control of the Church of Alexandria, because Bishop Peter has gone into exile, and then he is eventually arrested, and he now is in prison. And so this gentleman, Meletius, begins to kind of take up the mantle of leadership in Alexandria, and he will get ordained as a bishop, and he will essentially create a parallel church in Alexandria. There's a church under Peter, and then there's a church under Meletius. And finally, when the persecution all ends, at least initially ends in 313, there are two groups of Christians in Alexandria, a group under Meletius and a group that's under Peter and Peter's successors, who is Alexander. And Alexander is the bishop that Arius will have issues with. This schism does not get resolved. And so basically at the Council of Nicaea, there is an attempt to resolve this. And the resolution is as follows. The Christians who are under Meletius are not condemned or kicked out of the church, because the issue isn't theological, the issue is more structural. And so the Council of Nicaea decides that those who were in communion with Peter and now Alexander are the ones that are the rightful holders of a parish or of an episcopal see. The Meletians, who are associated with a particular parish or associated with a particular episcopal see, still can participate in those parishes, still can keep the title of priest or bishop, but they are second in rank under the priest or the bishop that is in communion with Alexander at this time. Should a bishop that's in communion with Alexander die, then the bishop that is affiliated with Meletius can then take the place and become the bishop, the official bishop of that see once it's vacant, as long as Alexander or the rightful bishop of Alexandria approves it. So this Meletian schism, although is resolved at Nicaea based on this kind of resolution, will continue even a bit further into the late 320s and 330s, but it will eventually die out. And then finally, there are 20 canons that we will dedicate a podcast to, and we will talk about those in that podcast. The council comes to a close probably in the early weeks of July. And right before the council closes, Constantine holds a final banquet. And most likely it takes place in Nicomedia. That is, Nicomedia is not far from Nicaea. Nicomedia is the imperial capital. It was the imperial capital of Diocletian. Constantine has not established Constantinople yet, and he's most likely residing in Nicomedia, although there's an imperial palace at Nicaea as well. But it's most likely that this grand banquet took place in Nicomedia. And Eusebius tells us about this celebration. It took place around the 25th of July, and this was to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Constantine's accession to the imperial throne, that is, to the title of Augustus. It was a remarkable banquet. Eusebius says, quote, "Not one of the bishops was wanting at the imperial banquet, that is, no one was missing. The circumstances," he continues, "of which were splendid beyond description. Detachments of the bodyguard and other troops surrounded the entrance of the palace with drawn swords, and through the midst of these the men of God," that is, the bishops, "proceeded without fear into the innermost of the imperial apartments, in which some were the emperor's own companions at table, while others reclined on couches arranged on either side. One might have thought that a picture of Christ's kingdom was thus shadowed forth, and a dream rather than a reality." Close quote. Following the banquet, it seems that the bishops return to Nicaea, and Constantine provides a final address to the bishops a few days later after this banquet. And the address does not survive, but Eusebius tells us the emperor emphasized unity. Eusebius also tells us that Constantine bade the bishops farewell and provided them with gifts according to their rank, as well as some financial assistance to take back to their local churches. That's the end of the Council of Nicaea. We do have bits and pieces about the council that come a bit later, about 60, 70, 80 years later, well into the 5th century, by church historians, will start to tell us about various stories that they now are putting down on paper. Eusebius of Caesarea, who attends the Council of Nicaea, was a church historian, and he writes this wonderful history of the early church. And he brings it up to about 306, and then he adds some more to 311, 312, but he doesn't say really anything about the Council of Nicaea except in his Life of Constantine. Writers at the end of the 4th century, as the beginning of the 5th century, will pick up the pen and they will continue where Eusebius left off. And these are gentlemen whose names we know, like Rufinus, we mentioned them in a previous podcast, Socrates, Sozomen, Theodoret, etc. And these church historians tell us some stories, additional stories and information about the council. How accurate they are, it's hard to say, but nonetheless, these are stories that have entered into the phronima, the tradition, if you will, of the Council of Nicaea within the Orthodox Church. For example, Rufinus and Socrates and Sozomen relate that at the council, Constantine received petitions from bishops who were bringing charges against one another. The story is told that Constantine receives the petitions, that is, one bishop is saying, "I don't like that bishop," or "He's come into my area." We don't know what the petition said. "He's come into my diocese and he shouldn't do that," etc., etc. We don't know what this said. But we're told that Constantine took all these petitions and burned them, making the statement that "I want peace. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of personal conflict. I want peace. We're not here to do this." It's not unusual for an emperor to have received petitions. That's what you do. If you get in front of the emperor and you have a case or something you want adjudicated, you make sure that he looks at that piece of paper or here's your case. So it's not impossible that this took place. But again, this is being written about 70, 80 years after the Council of Nicaea. There's another story of a bishop, Achicius, and Achicius was a Novatianist bishop. That is to say, he belonged to a group of Christians who were not in communion with the Orthodox and Catholic Church at the time over issues of purity of the church. And Achicius is presented in front of Constantine, and he keeps his position hard and fast and says, "No, I'm not in communion with you all because you guys are all part of this church that was very lenient to people back in the 250s, to Christians who had either sacrificed to the gods and now wanted to repent, and I don't believe they should have been given the opportunity to repent. And my group of Christians, called the Novatianists, after this Bishop Novatus, who was part of this group that challenged whether or not Christians could be brought back into the church if they had sacrificed to the gods." And Achicius is presented in front of Constantine, and Constantine famously says, quote, "Place a ladder, Achicius, and climb into heaven alone," close quote. In other words, you think you're the only one that's going to get into heaven, take a ladder, climb up, and go there by yourself. In the Orthodox tradition, there are three individuals that are associated with the Council of Nicaea in the later retellings of the council. Two of them are identified as attending the council by the 5th century church historians. That is Saint Spiridon, Bishop of Trimithus, and Saint Paphnutius of Upper Egypt. The third individual is Saint Nicholas of Myra. Regarding Saint Nicholas, there is no Nicholas of Myra's name who shows up on any of the signators at the Council of Nicaea. Again, those lists may not be complete, and at maximum you can come up with about 200, 240, 50 names from those lists that do survive. It doesn't mean St. Nicholas wasn't there. But it's important to point out what is the historical evidence that places Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea. So the earliest mention of St. Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea is not in the church historians of the 5th century. You would think that they would have mentioned this. The earliest reference comes in the 10th century. Doesn't mean that the story is that late. It could be much earlier. But basically it's in the 10th century, 9th and 10th century, in these texts that we call synaxaria or menologia, synaxarion in the singular or menologion in the singular. And these texts are texts that list the saints that are commemorated on a particular day, like we do today in our calendar of saints. And oftentimes they'll include a bit of biographical information about the saint. And in the entry for Nicholas on December 6th, in the Synaxarion of Constantinople, as well as the Menologion of Simeon Metaphrastes, these are two important texts that we know were in circulation and copied frequently in the right around the year 1000 AD. They date to about the year 1000 AD in Constantinople. And in both of these texts, we do find the story of Nicholas attending the Council of Nicaea, that he stood up and defended the faith against Arius. Some of you may have heard that Nicholas, also at the Council of Nicaea, slapped Arius. The problem with this story is, number one, there's no indication that Arius was ever at the council. Secondly, the earliest date for this story is found in a 16th century sermon by Damaskinos Studhitis. Damaskinos Studhitis was a bishop under the See of Constantinople in the 16th century, and he published a life, if you will, a long sermon. He calls it a logos, but he published a long sermon, a life of St. Nicholas. And this life of St. Nicholas is published in the Megas Synaxaristis of Doukas, which is a 19th century Synaxarion that the Greek church published. And this Synaxarion was a 14-volume work, which became incredibly popular in Greece and gets translated, or at least, it's been translated now into French, into English, etc., and becomes the foundation for the stories of many of the saints that we have. And Damaskinos Studhitis tells us that Nicholas slapped Arius on his cheek. Regarding St. Spiridon, his name does show up in some of the signatories for the Council of Nicaea. But Spiridon most likely is at the council because the story about him at the council is found as early as Socrates. So this 5th century church historian who's writing in the 430s, he tells us a story about Spiridon, who was the shepherd. He's bishop of this town of Trimithus on Cyprus, and he certainly could have made it to the Council of Nicaea. It's not far. Cyprus is not far from Asia Minor, and he would have been able to have gone up to Nicaea with really no problem at all. But the stories that are told about him are some miracle stories that are not necessarily associated with the Council of Nicaea. But to place him at the Council of Nicaea, I think, is not historically untenable. The story that many Orthodox have heard, that he stands up at the Council of Nicaea and holds a brick. And he says that in this brick, it's made of fire and mud and water. But it's a brick. And this is God. In other words, God is three in one. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Trinity, makes up God. Now, this story of Spiridon holding this brick, which catches on fire and water comes out of it, to demonstrate that the brick is made up of mud or dirt and fire and water, and Spiridon miraculously holds it in his hand. This story does not show up in any of the church historians of the 5th century. In fact, the story again shows up in the life of Saint Spiridon, written by the same Damaskinos Studitis in the 16th century, who wrote this story about, at least put down on paper, the story about Nicholas slapping Arius. So the story of Spiridon and the brick is also dated to the 16th century. A third figure that is associated with the Council of Nicaea and a saint in the Orthodox Church is Saint Paphnutios. There's no reason to doubt that Saint Paphnutios was at the Council of Nicaea. There are several Paphnutioses that show up on the calendar of the Orthodox Church. But this Paphnutius that is at the Council of Nicaea is most likely a bishop. He could have been an ascetic figure as well, attending the council. The story about St. Paphnutius is quite fascinating. It's told by Socrates, a church historian of the 5th century. And he enters into the council there, and Socrates tells us that Constantine saw Paphnutius with one of his eyes, the eye socket, his eyeball had been taken out. In other words, Paphnutius had been a Christian during the persecution, and he comes to the Council of Nicaea with actually the scars from persecution. Eusebius tells us the same thing, that there were bishops at Nicaea that came with visible scars from persecution. Remember, Christian persecution had not stopped formally until 311. Then it picks up again. Then it stops in 313. And in the East, it picks up again in 318, stops, but also picks up again in 320, 321. So there is plenty of opportunity for bishops to have been arrested, to have been put into the mines, to have been tortured, etc. And they show up at Nicaea bearing the scars of persecution and torture. Eusebius tells us that Constantine was really taken aback at this, and that, in fact, he would go up and kiss the scars of the places where there were scars of these remarkable bishops and saints. The story of Paphnutius, though, that Socrates continues to tell, is he says that at the council they were discussing whether or not bishops and priests should remain celibate. That is to say, if they were married and then they are elevated to the priesthood or ordained to the priesthood or to the diaconate or even to the episcopacy, if they are married, they should live as brother and sister with their wife. In other words, they shouldn't have any conjugal relations. Paphnutios stands up and he says that this burden is too heavy of a burden for priests who are married and for bishops who are married. And therefore, he says, don't do this. And the council agrees to that. It's a great story. If we look at the decisions of Nicaea, especially the 20 canons, there's no indication that they discussed this, or any canon that came out and said, priests can marry, bishops can marry, deacons can marry. There are these canons, but they're not coming out of Nicaea. In the Orthodox Church, May 29th is the day that the Synaxarion commemorates the memory of the Holy Fathers gathered at Nicaea. What's interesting is in the Synaxarion of Constantinople, the one that dates to around 1000, the number 318 doesn't appear. In that same entry, Constantine is referred to as Constantine the Great, the one among the saints. That's not unusual for Constantine to be called a saint in the Orthodox Church. He's considered a saint, not immediately after the council, but one can argue that certainly by the 5th, 6th century, if not earlier, he's considered a saint in the Orthodox Church. The Council of Nicaea had some remarkable people that were in attendance. We just talked a little bit about some of those that may or may not have been, but that the Orthodox Church considers being a part of the council. Constantine is there. Arius is not there. St. Athanasius does attend the council. He tells us he is there. He listened to the argument. He doesn't sign the decrees. He probably wasn't able to speak, but he does have conversations with people at the council, and he is there at the council. Osios of Cordoba, who is a saint in the Orthodox Church, he is there and he signs the documents, the decisions of the Council of Nicaea. Jacob of Nisibis, a famous bishop from the ancient city of Nisibis. Eustathius, bishop of Antioch, was there. He's a saint in the Orthodox Church as well. There are other individuals who are mentioned in the Orthodox calendar who we don't know for sure that were there. We've mentioned Spiridon, I think is there. Nicholas is in all possibility is there, but whose names do not show up in the lists, the lists that have survived for Nicaea. So some historians will say they weren't there. But in the Orthodox tradition, if you read their lives in the Synaxarion of Constantinople around the year 1000 AD, it says that they attended the Council of Nicaea. For example, St. Polychronios is said to have attended. St. Hypatios, Bishop of Gangra, who is commemorated on November 14th, attended. St. Achilleos of Larissa, commemorated on May 15th, is said to attended. St. Paul of Neo-Caesarea, commemorated on December 23rd, is said to have attended as well. And then St. John of Irinopoulos on February 5th is said to attend the Council of Nicaea. Certainly other individuals are at the council, and Alexander of Alexandria, Eusebius of Nicomedia, who is a close confidant of Constantine. Eusebius of Nicomedia was also a supporter of Arius and has a very storied history in the debates that take place after the Council of Nicaea. And then, of course, Eusebius of Caesarea, who is there as well. A remarkable gathering of 318 bishops, if we use the traditional number, along with their attendants, along with the imperial entourage, Constantine himself. The Council of Nicaea must have been an absolutely remarkable gathering. For the Christian church, a church that had been persecuted, a faith that it was illegal to be a member of some 20 years earlier, if not just 10 to 15 years earlier, is now being supported, is now being defended, is being called together by the same imperial office that once persecuted the church. It is a remarkable moment in the history of Christianity. For the Orthodox Church, and I would say for the Catholic Church, but even for the Protestant churches, the council is a watershed. It's a watershed theologically because it is the moment in time where Christianity will officially lay claim to its belief that Jesus Christ is divine. Not that the church didn't believe this before, not that the apostles didn't believe this before. That's not the point. The point is that the church now has drawn a very black line, a very thick line in the sand, and said that this is the faith. This is the faith. Christ is divine, and this is how the church is going to move forward. The next 70 years or so after the council are fairly tumultuous because not everybody was on board with the creed. And we do have an episode that will talk about the difference between the Creed of Nicaea and then what most of us understand as the Nicene Creed today that is recited in the Orthodox Church in our liturgy and in other places in baptism as well. But it's at the Council of Nicaea that the foundations for the creed are laid. It's at the Council of Nicaea that there is an attempt to bring about unity in praxis, in the practice, with respect to the celebration of Easter. And it's also a watershed moment in the relationship of church and state, a relationship that was quite the opposite for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. And now for the next 1,000 years, even longer in the West, where we can start talking about Christendom and ask the question, is this relationship between church and state, is it positive, is it negative, what are the drawbacks, what are the positive elements of it? And Christianity and the history of the Orthodox Church will need to deal with this issue as time moves on. A special thank you to the St. Romanos the Melodist Choir of Helena College and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology for their rendition of the Apolitikion of the Elevation of the Holy Cross. The artistic director of the choir is Reverend Dr. Romanos Karanis.